Hello, everyone. We are live again with yet another author today. This is Sunday series, author live chat with fans, real life inspiring stories. 16th January 2022, 8 p.m. CST. We are live on Facebook page, International Book Promotion. And today we have an author joining us to talk about her own journey in finding her roots, in finding her birth family. I'm so very excited to be talking to her. So, uncovering family secrets and birth family. So, that's the whole subject of today's show. And I'm really excited to be talking to Rebecca Daniels. I read her book, and I have to say that it's really fascinating with the amount of effort she put in to discover, to trace back her birth family, and the kind of struggles, the kind of challenges that she had to face throughout the many years, you know, in trying to trace both her father's and also her mother's side of the family. So here's a little bit about Rebecca. Rebecca taught performance, writing, and speaking in liberal arts universities for over 25 years, including St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York from 1992 to 2015. She was the founding producing director of Artists Repertory Theatre in Portland and directed with many professional Portland theatre companies in the 1980s. She is the author of the groundbreaking Women Stage Directors Speak and has been published in multiple professional theatre journals. In 2015, she retired from teaching and moved to the Pioneer Valley in Western Massachusetts, where in 2018 she completed the manuscript for Keeping the Lights On, a book based on her father's letter home from Europe during the World War II, which was published in 2019 by Sunbury Press. In 2019, she also served as a literary manager and co-producer for Silverthorne Theater Company in Greenfield. Lately, she has been working on two full-length plays and recently completed a memoir called Finding Sisters, and that explores how DNA testing helped her to find her genetic parents and other relatives in spite of being given up for a closed adoption at birth. So, without further ado, let's welcome author Rebecca Daniels to the show.
Hello.
Hello, Rebecca. Hello. It's a
Hello.
pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining the show. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us, Rebecca. I mean, I read your book and I think it's really fascinating, and I thought it's a good opportunity to talk to you and to learn more about your experience tracing your family. And here we are today. On the show, on the Sunday series show, which is dedicated for non-fiction books, and we are here with your latest book. As mentioned earlier, your latest book, your memoir, Finding Sisters. So I have actually briefly introduced yourself a little bit, but I think it'd be good to hear a little bit more from you about yourself, Rebecca.
About myself? Okay. Well, as my introduction, which I use in the book itself, says, I was an educator for many, many years. I taught primarily theater courses, and I also taught writing for general students and communication skills for usually first year students, and directed plays with the theater department. Also did a fair bit of directing outside the theater department in small theaters in a variety of cities and a couple of other universities as a guest artist. When I retired, down here in Western Massachusetts, I turned primarily to writing, though I still was involved in some theater companies. And as you mentioned in your introduction, I finished the story about my parents, which I call Keeping the Lights On for Ike, which is how my mother always used to say what my dad's job was during the war, because he was a utilities engineer at Allied Force headquarters in North Africa and then in Italy. And so that's what that book is about, and it's based in letters that he wrote home. And when that was done, I turned to another adventure that I'd had fairly recently, and that was my DNA search for my genetic family members, which I started in 2014 and continued. I mean, it's still kind of ongoing. New relatives pop up all the time on the databases, but the biggest mysteries were solved before I wrote Finding Sisters, which is that I have two sisters, one maternal sister and one paternal sister. So they are not related to each other, but I'm related to both of them. And I was able to meet my birth mother before she died. She was in her mid-80s when we met in 2015. And my birth father actually died when I was an infant and probably never knew about me, but I was eventually able to connect to cousins, first cousins, that had always felt they had been told there was a family mystery, that their grandmother was going to take to her grave, but they figured that was probably me. And they didn't necessarily realize that there were two of us, that our father had, he actually had two girlfriends in the same summer, got them both pregnant. And my sister and I are basically almost exactly the same age. I'm 4 days older than she is, and we have different mothers. And then I'm also writing about my experience as a widow. My husband died in 2010, and so hopefully my next book will be that memoir, but it's not done yet. So that's a little more about me.
Right. So, coming to this, the book Finding Sisters, right? When I was reading the book, I noticed that it was not your intention to trace your birth family, as in to have some sort of attachment with them or anything like that. But you always had this desire to have sisters, right? In your life,
Yes.
you always had that. And I think that is the one that prompted you to, kind of like trace back your family, right? So, yeah. Am I right to say that?
Yes, you are. It's not the only reason, but I always had women friends, and those who had sisters, I always envied them, that special bond with their sisters. So I was a little jealous that I didn't have any sisters. And while that wasn't the only reason that I did DNA testing, I was hoping there might be sisters in what I discovered. I was ready for almost anything, but I was secretly hoping there would be sisters.
Right. And so talking about the family that adopted you, your childhood, how was it back then, like, growing up, and maybe when was it that you discovered that you were adopted? Maybe a little bit about your childhood.
I don't remember ever not knowing that I was adopted. My parents were very, very clear that I was adopted, but I was wanted. I had been chosen for this family. And I suspect I was probably first told when my little brother came along, because there was no biological basis for him. He was also adopted. So I imagine, being the kind of precocious and curious 3-year-old that I was, I probably asked a lot of questions about where my brother came from. And they must have told me, because I frankly never thought it was anything else, you know. So they were very upfront about, I was adopted, but I was chosen. So there was no big surprise, no, oh my gosh, what, you know, how is my life going to change? Because nothing changed, because it had always been clear to me.
Right. And so your brother, you have a younger brother, and
Yeah.
who was also adopted, right? So, how was it like growing up for the two of you? And your brother, did he also choose to find his birth family? I mean, after looking at your journey right now.
Actually, my brother had no desire to find his birth family. I didn't really. I was curious, but I didn't need to find my birth family. But I had enough issues with hereditary things. I have a disease of the eyes that is hereditary. And when I was a young woman, I was counseled about, if I ever wanted to have children, I should have genetic counseling, because of the fact that I could pass that eye deficiency on to my children. Now, I didn't have children, that was never an issue, but that did make me wonder about my genetics, you know. But it was more of a curiosity than a need to know. And my brother just really, I mean, we were your average brother and sister of the time, you know, a 1950s family, 2 kids, a working dad, a stay-at-home mom. We were a pretty typical suburban family. And he never wanted to know much. He was interested in his ethnic background. Excuse me. But when he did a DNA test, he chose to be someone who would not contact any of his matches. He just wanted to know what his ethnic makeup was, which was interesting for him, different than mine. And I ran into people like him when I was trying to connect to some of my matches, who basically wanted to know more about themselves, but really didn't want to know much more about their families. He was perfectly happy with the family we had, and he didn't want to know anything new. And in fact, I waited until both of our parents were deceased before I did my DNA testing.
Okay, right. So your parents, I mean, were they aware of your desire to trace your birth family? Have you discussed about that with them?
No, I never discussed it with them as an adult. When I was a teenager, I had lots of questions, and they had very few answers because of the nature of closed adoptions in the 50s, 40s, late 40s and early 50s. So privacy was paramount. So they had no information to help me with. They had one piece of paper with a name on it, and that was it. And there was a brief waiting period before I was legally theirs. And Mom said they weren't even supposed to have that paper, that she thought it was a mistake that it had been sent to them. So, and once I was an adult, it didn't seem relevant to talk to them about it. And when I did decide to do it, they had both been dead for a while. So there was nobody to talk to about that. I mean, I did let my brother know what I was doing, but but he said, well, okay, fine, I'm not going to do that. And he was totally fine with me doing it and me writing the book. He was very supportive, but he wasn't interested in doing the same thing.
So he supported you. He supported you along your journey. Like I think you kept him informed about your discoveries.
Well, he wasn't eager to hear every single detail, but he didn't think it was a bad thing that I did that. He just wasn't all that concerned with it one way or the other. But he said, sure, Beck, go for it.
Right. And so your journey, I think you took the DNA testing when you learned that you have this hereditary disease of the eye and you wanted to learn more about it. Was that the first time that you took your DNA testing?
No, actually, I knew about the eye disease when I was a teenager. I thought about DNA testing when I was married, and that was in my late 20s and early 30s. But then my husband at the time made it very clear that he wasn't interested in having children. Not yet, and apparently not ever. We eventually divorced before that came to a test, but so I never did it while I was married to my first husband. And then it seemed irrelevant for a very long time.
Right. And so the whole thing about finding your birth family, exactly when did it start? Which year, and what was the exact thing that actually prompted you to?
Oh, the thing that prompted me to do the testing, I had a girlfriend who talked me into it because she wanted to test and she wanted a testing buddy because she was also adopted and she wanted someone who was looking at the same kind of situation that she was. And so we bought our kits together and sent in the stuff, and then she started making some contact with her relatives, and she was biracial, and she got frustrated because a number of her white relatives weren't interested in maintaining contact with her because she identified primarily as African American. During that time period that she was getting frustrated, I wasn't finding any matches at all, or fourth cousin, fifth cousin. I didn't know what to do with them. I had no names except this one name, which actually turned out to be helpful when it came to looking for records, but I didn't know how to do that yet. And I had no other ancestral names to search for. So there wasn't much I could do. And particularly when you get to third, fourth, and fifth cousins, they usually don't, you might have an ancestry in common, but if you don't know any names, you don't know how to find any of them.
And the whole process of this DNA testing and waiting for the emails to come through and talking to people who you think that maybe related to you and trying to convince them, the whole process is just so was it taxing? Was it mentally taxing, or were you excited through the process?
it was challenging in many ways. In some cases, you're approaching strangers completely, and it's a little scary to do that, to say, hi, you don't know me, but we might be related. On the other hand, if they're in the database and the database tells us that we have DNA in common, that's a way to open the door a little bit. But there were some people who I contacted who said, oh yeah, this person was related to me, but I don't think I need to tell you my name. So they weren't interested in being in touch. But I was very lucky that many of the people that I did have connections to wanted to be in touch. And most importantly, I had a sixth cousin in Sweden who initiated contact with me and said he knew where my ancestors had come from because they were his ancestors too. And that was very exciting. And he also is the one who taught me how to use all of the databases that allowed, and actually, to be honest, he did most of the finding for me in the early weeks of that time period. It was 2014 when I put in my first test in February. And then it was 2015, early in the year, when I heard from Cousin Thomas. And so there was almost a year of not much happening. And then there was when he was in touch with me, it was in early or to mid-February of 2015. And within a month, he'd found a candidate that he thought was a good bet for my birth mother, partly because of the unique nature of her maiden name. Because of and it was not a common name, a little bit old-fashioned. And so he felt that there were only a couple of women with that name in the right age range that he found in the census data from that time period, born in 1929. And so he thought it was a good bet, and he found me a current address. And so I wrote her a letter. That was the I think we might be related letter, because I thought, maybe it's not such a great idea to call someone up and say, hey, I think you're my mom. That's a little, if that's a secret she wanted to keep, I wanted to give her an out because of the stigma that was associated with out of wedlock birth in that time frame. So I wrote that letter, and her daughter, my half-sister, emailed me because I had given them the contact and said, I know my mom gave up a child before she married my dad, and I suspect that's you. Let's talk. So it was actually my half-sister, my maternal half-sister, who wanted to talk because I had left my mom an out, and we decided to do a DNA test to confirm. And it was true. She was, in fact, my mom. But by that time, she was in her middle 80s and she had some cognitive challenges. So, but she wanted to meet me. She wanted to be found, which was exciting because I'd read a lot of narratives about adoptee reunions, and in some cases, people just didn't want to be found. The stigma was so great. They just felt that's a secret better kept secret. But I was happy that Glenna, my mother, my birth mother, was happy to meet me and to acknowledge me. that was a very special moment.
Right, and I think that all throughout the short period of time that you were in contact with your birth mother, she was ill, and she was not really doing good in terms of her health. And I think soon after that she passed away, right?
Yeah, it was just a few months after that she passed away. So I was absolutely delighted that I was able to meet her before that happened.
Mhm. And your maternal half sister and yourself, the two of you, and I think the search for your father began after that, right? After
Oh, yes,
your birth
absolutely.
mother.
And because my mother had dementia, she couldn't remember his name.
Mm.
And every time my sister, my half sister, tried to get her to talk about it or to remember more about it, she would burst into tears. And we never knew for sure whether they were tears of frustration at not being able to remember, whether he was mean to her or made her unhappy in some way, or whether she was just unhappy that she'd lost his name somewhere in the fog
Mm.
of her dementia.
Mhm.
So there were not the same kinds of clues that I'd had from that
Mhm.
piece of paper about my mother. Um,
Mhm.
and what happened then was a year after I met my mother, all of a sudden I had a match, a DNA match that was a significant family match. And it was either going to be um, a half sibling, a first cousin, or perhaps a grandparent if it was an older person. And the person who had put the sample in was a new customer and so didn't have a profile yet. So I sent
Mhm.
a letter, an email out to her to say, hey, it looks like we're related pretty closely. Here's who I am. You know, do you know I was adopted? Do you know your background? And it turned out that this person was a paternal half sister, that we shared a father, and that she too had been adopted. So her name was her adoptive family's last name, the way mine was.
Mhm.
So eventually, a year after that, I was able to meet her in person, as she lived in Oregon, which was the state I grew up in. And I was going to my 50th high school reunion that summer. And so her town was about, I think, 90 miles away from where I had gone to high school. So we met halfway in between and started a relationship and told each other everything that we knew about our mothers and about what little we knew about our father, and putting those pieces together with the little that I knew. I knew from Glenna that my dad was a pilot, but not a military pilot, and that they'd met at a dance. And my half sister knew that her father had worked on a traveling combine crew and had come through the town where Anne's mother was living, and they had a one night stand. And
Mhm.
so, and a combine crew is an agricultural a combine, big piece of agricultural equipment. And so we tried to put all of that together to think about an agricultural pilot. So maybe someone who did crop dusting or that sort of thing, which put me, well, actually, and then Anne and I both put our DNA samples into a new database, because one of the things I learned in the process of this journey was that your connections are only as good as the people in your database. So there are several major providers of DNA testing. And if you want to get the broadest coverage, you really have to test with more than one. And so I ended up testing with a second service, and Anne did too. And we got a whole bunch of new and interesting matches. And among them was a family that looked promising, had a lot of farmers and ranchers as part of it, part of the family. And but it turned out that I was related to them, but Anne wasn't. And so then there was a second family that also was from the Midwest, and that Anne and I both were related to, that actually turned out to be who we were more connected to. And the story gets really complicated at that point, because I was the adopted child of an adopted child. And I had discovered that when I met my mother, that she too had been adopted. So she didn't know who her parents were either. So I had a double mystery, well, a triple mystery, you know, who were my mother's parents, and then who was my father when my mother couldn't remember his name, you know. So the rest of the search stretched out for another about 18 months, and getting people who actually hadn't been in the database to agree to test at my expense, and then to try to figure out how all the pieces fit together. It was like a huge jigsaw puzzle.
And I think interestingly, I mean, tracing your father was a little bit tricky because of the lack of information. Probably
Right.
it was rather complicated at that point of time. It was not as straightforward as it was in searching for your birth mother as compared to your birth father, right? So, did you ever feel like giving up along the way, because of...
Did I feel like giving up? Probably about every other day, but I just kept plugging away at it, because by then I was invested. And I don't necessarily mean I needed to know, but there was a mystery, and it was just at my fingertips. And there were so many new relatives trying to figure out how they all worked together to create my ancestral history, both maternal and paternal, as it turned out. Because I think I also came very close to finding my maternal grandfather because of some cousins who were willing to test. And I found that I was able to find my father a little more unambiguously, because he died very young in a plane crash. So yes, he was a pilot. And unfortunately, he crashed into a mountainside in a very dense fog just before he was about to be married. So he was in his early 20s when that happened. And so finding him meant finding relatives who were close in that family. And they were very willing to do DNA testing. Finding the grandfather who had fathered my mother was harder because of the distance in generations but also because that family was a little less willing to get involved in DNA testing. But most of the traditional genealogy research I did and the matches that I did have within that larger clan pointed to a very specific candidate. It's just that his son refused to take a DNA test to actually confirm it. But it's about, unless there's some other son in that family that nobody knows about that was my grandfather, then it's probably the guy I think it is. And that gives me about an 85% certainty that I know who my genetic grandfather is, even though at least a couple of his relatives don't want to accept that as reality.
And so finally, after finding all the missing puzzles and having figured out who the important people, in your birth families, your birth mother, your birth father, and your half sisters. And now, how does it feel like, finally when everything just falls into place and the whole thing is just complete? How did you feel?
Well, it's actually a very cool thing to have these half sisters. It's a little peculiar because I never knew them growing up. I'm genetically related to them, but we didn't grow up together. So we're more like good friends, kind of distant friends, because one lives in Nebraska and the other lives in Oregon and I live in Massachusetts. So we email a lot, we exchange cards at the holidays and birthdays, and we're in touch regularly. I will probably see my Oregon sister more often simply because the brother I grew up with still lives in Oregon and I go there every few years. I'm not sure I'll have an occasion to go to Nebraska again anytime soon, but we do stay in touch regularly. And they were very supportive of the book.
And now, you told that you're still discovering relatives every now and then, through the emails. Are you still trying to trace those people?
If I found anyone who was closer to me than a third or fourth cousin, I would probably try to get in touch. I would first have to do a little sleuthing to figure out who they connect to. Do they connect to me and Anne, or do they connect only to me and thus to April and Glenna? And then I would probably send an email. But so far, all the new matches are more distant cousins. So I haven't worked too hard at getting in touch with them, and they're not making an attempt to get in touch with me either.
Right. So, and since the book is out and I believe your family and friends have read the book, so what kind of feedbacks have you gotten from them so far?
I've gotten excellent feedback from them. They're very supportive. I'm not sure how many of them have actually read it of the friends, but the handful that I know have read it all the way through have given me 5-star reviews on Goodreads or Amazon or both, and are very complimentary about how engaging the book was, what an interesting story it was. Some people have likened it to a mystery, almost like a novel, because as I was telling you before the broadcast, I was incredibly lucky There are people who spend years and years looking for their relatives and never have the kind of success that I found. That was a pure luck that I was in the right databases with the right people. And so I'm aware that not everybody gets these kinds of results, but it was like a mystery, which is why even when I was discouraged, I kept going because I thought I need to find the answer. You know, just like when you read a good mystery, you want to know who done it or what happened, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what would your message be to people out there who are trying to trace their birth family? And what advice would you give them?
Well, I would give them the advice that says, don't expect too much because my success was unexpected to me.
Mm-hmm.
I was particularly lucky because my cousin, Thomas, who knew a lot about both genealogy research and DNA and genetics, because he was a chemist in Sweden, was able to help me. And there are lots of organizations that will help people. And so I would say, don't expect too much, but ask a lot of questions and connect with the organizations that are set up to help people like us. And there's an appendix in the book that has some of those resources available for
Yeah.
people to look into. But anyone who thinks they're going to find their family for sure and in short order, that doesn't happen very often. And so I really feel like, I don't want to call it a miracle, but it was definitely a surprise and a very special thing that I actually did come through with the answers I was seeking. And when I first started, it was kind of like, well, it'd be cool to know some of this. And then, of course, the more you know, the more you want to know. And it just keeps going from there, which is why people who do genealogy become so obsessed with it. It's because the
Uh-huh.
more you know, the more you want to know.
Yeah. Awesome. Right. So we are nearing the end of the show, and
Mhm.
I think it's a pleasure to have you here to talk about your book and also how you managed to trace your birth family, your experiences. It's really I think the whole book is kind of like not just for those who are trying to trace their birth family, but also for the rest of us who, who don't have the desire to look for a birth family or probably, you just want to have a good read, especially those who are interested in the sheer mystery in the whole mystery of it, right? Like, I don't feel that this whole thing is like a mystery novel. Like you're reading something and you're discovering the answers at the end of the book. It does feel like that, but I think it's very much of a real life story, and those who are trying to figure out their birth family will definitely be able to benefit from this. And I also have to say, I think those who have read this book will also have the urge to do a DNA testing for themselves and just try to probably figure out their genealogy, where they came from, or probably what mixture of heritage they are inheriting. So those kind of things I think are really, really interesting. And I think those who are reading it will definitely feel tempted
Yeah.
to do.
And one other thing I want to say to people who want to do this journey, even if you think you know your family, be prepared for surprises because sometimes there are secrets in past generations that get uncovered by DNA testing.
Mm,
So stay
mm.
flexible and be prepared for almost anything.
Awesome, right, fantastic. And with that, we have come to the end of the show, Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining us and and for talking and for sharing experiences today. It's a pleasure having you here, and it is also a pleasure having the chance to read your book. It was fantastic. Thank you so much for
Thank
that,
you. It was
and
lots
hopefully
of fun.
we will be able to meet in any other occasions in the future for probably another interview. Hoping to stay in touch with you. Hoping to see you soon next time. Till then, take care and stay safe. This interview will be available for replay as soon as we have ended the broadcast. It's going to be available for replay. I will also be putting this up on YouTube and Instagram, so people will also be able to watch it there. Yeah, so pretty much that's about it. And thank you so much. See you
Thank you.
soon.